Okay, great. Well, good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. There are about 5 people over the course of the E201 and 201B, maybe not quite that many, actually, more like 4, that for whom the response to their presentation is so good that I make every effort to get them to come back. And sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. Reminding, of course, the speaker and myself that, in effect, although you're more than welcome to take this class as many times as you want, you can only get credit for it once. And on that assumption, we'll assume that you weren't here last year at this time. But Don Tretzler, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Applied Signal Technology, is one of these 4 or 5 people. And he's agreed to come back and give us an update. Again, for you it will be completely new, on a fascinating topic, using technology to keep other companies and even other countries honest. I think you're going to find this very interesting. It's going to cover a lot of ground, and it's going to do so in an exciting way. Applied Signal Technology is also a company that's hiring people, and they brought a few goodies along for you to pick up after class if you want to come up and talk to them. These are, in fact, Frisbees, Applied Technology Frisbees, and these are special footballs with special things inside. And it does say on the football, we could tell you what we do, but then we'd have to hire you. So you'll hear some things today that you probably won't hear elsewhere. Also, I brought some candy for you. It's actually not candy, it's healthy granola bars. And so basically the message is, please come on up after class, and if you want to find out more about what Applied Technology is doing. Now, there's some other people from Applied here, well, one other person, and you, young man, sat in this very room some time ago.
That's right, in 2001 when I graduated.
2001. And I don't look a minute older now than I did then. Right. Very good. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about John, our speaker, though. He is an IEEE fellow. He was born in Texas, Velasco, Texas. Okay. I won't say when. He received, but it was certainly after I was born, he received his bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering from Rice University. Anybody? Anybody from Rice?
There ought to be.
I tell you. Did somebody raise their hand? No. No matter what school I mention, it doesn't seem to, nobody seems to be here that day from that school. And he got his PhD, of course, not of course, but he got his PhD from Stanford here in 1977. From 1970 to 1974, he was in the U.S. Navy as a line officer aboard destroyers. From 1977 to 1983, he was employed with Argo Systems Incorporated, now a subsidiary of Boeing. He co-founded Applied Signal Technology Incorporated in Sunnyvale in 1984 and is currently their Chief Technology Officer. He's also a member of the Board of Directors. Applied Signal designs and builds advanced signal processing equipment, which is used by the United States government and its allies. He has served as a lecturer at Stanford and spent the 1983-84 academic years at Cornell as an associate professor. But I guess, Cornell? No. Okay. I guess just looking at the news now and seeing the weather in New York while you're here, another reason why you're here. Well, we're all here. Those of you who are here for the first time this year, you know, this is your first year here, I need to tell you that it is going to get a little cooler before it gets warm again. But it is wonderful when June arrives here, particularly when it comes in February. In 1991, as I mentioned, he was selected as an IEEE Fellow, and in 2001 was given the IEEE Signal Processing Society's Technical Achievement Award and the IEEE Third Millennium Award. Well, with all of that, I'm delighted to welcome you back, John. It's just great.
Well, and I'm happy to be here. Or, speaking more colloquially, hi, y'all. That's to indicate my Texas roots. And to carry the tradition even further, I sat in EE 201 in the fall of 1974. I was 2 years old. Actually, that's not exactly true, but seems like that. Part of the reason, y'all can hear me okay? I'm not used to amplifications, so I seem to speak loudly, but that's okay. Part of the reason I left this date, which is an old one on there, is that is the first time I did this talk for this group. But it turns out that what I'm going to talk about today has a little bit more resonance in the news just lately, if you've happened to pay attention in the newspaper. So I'm going to tell you a story about a line of work that you might not even have imagined seriously existed, or at least you might not have imagined that it existed until the New York Times started publishing articles right before Christmas. Okay, and I'm going to be assiduously unpolitical, but if you ask me questions as we go along, which is actually fair game, I will respond as levelly as possible. But what I'm going to talk about today is something called, well, in general, technical intelligence, the idea of using technical means to collect information about what else is going on in the world. So in theory, your decision makers can make intelligent decisions. I understand there's some theory involved, and theory doesn't often match practice, okay, but still nonetheless, our objective here is to figure out what's going on in the world, make it clear to your policymakers so that the right actions can be taken if that's possible. I'm going to come back to this picture in a minute, a little bit later, but I want you to just look at that a moment and try to imagine where that might be and why this picture would figure into this discussion. Okay, and you probably have your guesses all right. There's mountains and there's snow, so it must be Tahoe, and I wish I were there right now. Okay, but that's not the answer. Okay, to frame this properly, I'm going to use an example, and I'm not picking sides in any geopolitical argument. It's just that when I put this talk together, I had to work very carefully to keep it unclassified. So when you want to make it unclassified, then what you do is you take things out of the newspaper because everybody agrees that must be okay. Okay? So here's an example, right out of our very own local Mercury News newspaper. It's an article, well, you can read the date, 18th of May, 1998. And so here I am reading my newspaper just up the road, and I read that the new Prime Minister of India, well, new 8 years ago, says, I've been thinking about it, and I've been thinking maybe nuclear weapons would be a cool thing to have. Well, it doesn't matter what I think about it, reading about it on the kitchen table here, but if I were the President of the United States reading this similar report, I would probably think about it on a grander scale and say, I wonder if this is true. I wonder how much of it is true. I wonder how far along they are. I wonder what we should do about it. I wonder what everybody else thinks about it. Should there be an international reaction to this? I don't know. So, in the best tradition of Ghostbusters from many years ago, you might ask yourself the question, who is the President of the United States going to call when such a question comes up? Okay? Right? Okay, well, that happened to be Bill Clinton, and none of us happens to remember that far back to remember who all the key people are. So I'll show you in block diagram form, and I'll even mention who the current people are who would fit in there. But actually the first person El Presidente is going to call when he looks at this in modern day 2006, he's going to call up his security advisor, national security advisor. Anybody know who that is? Well, anybody know who it used to be until about a year ago? Yeah. Let's see, she hung around here, some young lady. Anyway, she's younger than I am, which is scary. Anyway, let's go back a year or so. You would have called Condoleezza Rice. He still calls her the provost, by the way, if that helps you at all. And say, what about this? And so who is she going to call when she says, oh, I'll get right back to you? Well, she's going to call nowadays something called the Director of National Intelligence. Just a year or so ago, she would have called the Director of Central Intelligence. But we've reorganized the government a little bit in response to 9/11. And so the Director of National Intelligence has below him on the order of, because nobody can exactly keep the count right, 18 different organizations, okay, that are one way or the other part of the American intelligence community. Okay, well, being engineers that we are, we tend to immediately try to organize this because 18 of anything is too many to remember. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is organize them into those people who actually collect intelligence. Okay, well, that's what you would think an intelligence agency was, but that's really not true. So there's the people who actually collect it. I'll mention some of those in a minute. There's organizations who build the things that the collectors use to collect, and then there's organizations who analyze the data that's produced by the other ones. So there's three parts of it. It turns out there's only a handful of builders. There's actually not many collectors, but there's a whole bunch of users. Let me use some examples, and once again, the world has been kinder to me, and I can speak of this in an unclassified fashion. There's an organization which was once tippy-top secret called the National Reconnaissance Office. They build satellites. Exactly how many, where they are, and what they do is classified, but the fact that they exist and they build satellites isn't classified, at least anymore. So suppose you build a satellite that takes pictures. I'll show you an example later. Suppose you do that. Who is actually going to operate it and process the data? Well, an outfit named the National Geospatial Agency actually operates and receives the data. Or are they the intelligence analysts? No. It turns out there's all sorts of people, and believe it or not, you might not know, but the Department of Treasury, the Department of Energy, the Secret Service, there's all these people have an intelligence analysis organization that takes in signals and pictures and human reports and that sort of thing, and open source, reading newspapers and listening to radio broadcasts, and takes it all in and tries to provide intelligence for the purpose of their own leaders, of their own part of the executive branch. All this stuff works in the executive branch of the United States government. Something that is a matter of some discussion in the news lately about, is it the legislative branch or the executive branch that actually runs the intelligence community? More on that. So anyway, El Presidente is going to call the security advisor. The security advisor calls the director of national intelligence, who then fans out the question to all of his collectors and analyzers, and hopefully they would produce back answers that would be like, oh, no, don't worry about it. Yeah, you ought to worry about it, or how about next Thursday? It can be anything like that. So, a question you might ask, a number of questions you might ask is, how did we get this? Okay, how did it come to be put together? Why do we even care? Why does the United States government spend literally billions and billions of dollars every year on creating and operating this capability, producing things called national intelligence estimates and such as that? Okay, why did we decide this was a good idea? Now, the bad news is that in the kind of job I am and the company I work for, I can't tell you anything juicy about the last 10 years or maybe even the last 20 or 30 years. So in order to give you some perspective on all this, I have to go back historically to where it's safe. And I'm going to go all the way back to the First World War, which was, as you might imagine, even older than I am. Okay, and give you two examples. It turns out these two examples had to do with something called signals intelligence, the collecting of signals to either help you understand a tactical situation or a strategic situation. And I want to show you how they came about. And there's actually two results I'm going to tell you ahead of time. There are two results of these two stories. One is that the value of collecting signals intelligence became obvious to anybody who ran a country. And the second thing is the set of circumstances outlined here unintentionally made the United States a superpower. So as soon as you became a superpower, perhaps without even wanting to. And number two, you come to understand that collecting technical intelligence is important. You're on the pathway to establishing the kind of structure I just showed you a few minutes ago. Okay? Got the framework? I even told you the answer already. So now I'll tell you the story that leads to the answer. Anybody know what happened on the 4th of August, 1914? I mean, just thinking about it. Well, almost all of you had American history in 8th grade. Okay? Not all, but most. And the answer is, or European history, or whatever. The answer is the First World War seriously started. Now, there was some walking up to it a few days before, but if you really want a minute, pick the very first minute of the 4th of August, 1914. Anybody should have known it was going to happen because for the previous 35 years, everybody in Europe got out every summer and practiced war. This is literally true. They all would go on summer maneuvers. They would all invite observers from every other country to show how big and bad they were on the block. Okay, and the idea was that people would sort of stay in their box because they knew how powerful, for example, Germany was and how powerful Russia was and so forth. What happened in 1914 is that that defense mechanism no longer worked. What had happened is alliances had formed, and I've shown them in general terms in green, the UK and France and Russia. Another alliance had formed, which is Germany and Austria. Italy wasn't actually a part of it yet, nor was Turkey, but they joined later. And every summer, these guys would go practice, and these guys would watch. And these guys would practice, and these guys would go watch. And it became clear what was going to happen if there was ever a reason for a war. What happened was Germany had built an incredible set of railroads. And its plan was to count on the fact that Russia would take 6 months to a year to get organized for a war. During that time, Germany was going to swing through all the way down to France and basically take all those countries, move all of its armies across here, and be able to defeat Russia when Russia finally got organized to come in. Russia had the biggest army in all of Europe. It actually had an army bigger than all the rest of Europe put together. Well, everybody knew that was their plan. So much did they know that was the plan that France actually paid money to Russia to try to get organized to be able to mobilize more quickly if that were necessary. Okay, so that was the situation. Does anybody in here remember what actually is officially the thing that kicked off the First World War? Anybody ever heard of a guy named Archduke Ferdinand? Okay, he was cruising down the street in what city? Anybody know? Sarajevo, just a real calm place to this day. Okay, and a couple guys, always described as anarchists, came and killed him. Well, that was bad because it turns out that Sarajevo had the support of the Russians. The Serbs had the support of the Russians. It was a Austro-Hungarian. Archduke Ferdinand was of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this was a direct affront. You need to apologize. You need to pay each other off. Whatever you need to do. But in fact, what everybody did was just sort of swell up their chest and say, my old man's bigger than your old man. Okay? And before you knew it, in about a month and a half, what happened is all the green guys were threatening all the yellow guys, and the yellow guys were threatening all the green guys. And what happened is ultimata, I think that's plural for ultimatum, but I never can remember. Ultimata were stated and ignored, and what happened is the clock ticked up to to midnight of the 3rd of August. Is everybody was at war, whether they wanted to be at war or not? In many ways preventable, but it wasn't. Partly because some people were itching to go do it. Well, people will argue about who was itching the most. Okay, but as soon as the 1st, 3rd, and 4th of August came along, everybody who wasn't already mobilizing did it very quickly. The Russians felt a deep compulsion to get going because the French had been paying them. They had been building railroads so they could move stuff up to the front. The Germans, in the meanwhile, were moving stuff to the west because that was their war. They called it the swinging door. They were going to just swing through the Low Countries and into France and take them out in about 2 or 3 months, and then move the armies across. Now, this 2 or 3 months turns out to be really important because these guys, when they practiced during the summer, that's all the stuff they ever took. They took 2 or 3 months worth of stuff. Food, horses, food for the horses. Yeah, most of the armies ran on horses. Okay, bullets, all that sort of stuff. They were going to have a big summer war, and then it was going to be over. Well, here's what happened. The Russians surprised everybody and actually organized enough to move several big armies out across into what is now Poland, but was then called Prussia. Prussia was very, very important to the leadership of Germany because they were, in fact, Prussians. Okay, so that was going to be real bad if they lost their homeland. So what they did is they took part of their army and moved it back over here in order to get ready for the Russians coming. A few details. When the Russians got underway in a big hurry, they forgot some stuff. It didn't seem too consequential. For example, they didn't bring enough hay for the horses. Well, that's hard to see how that figures into the story. But they didn't bring enough wire for telephones. Now you say, who cares about telephones? Well, if you're trying to run an army, the army needs to communicate. And a very nice, secure way of communicating is by having telephones and running wires in between them, or telegraphs as well. So they didn't take enough wire. That would be bad. So if you don't have wire and you need to communicate, what are you going to use? radio, something fairly brand new. It was only in the previous 10 years that people actually had radios that were suitable for going off with an army, but they were going to communicate on the radio. Well, that's okay, so long as you do it securely, but what else did they forget when they left early? They forgot any cryptographic material. Okay, so they're out there marching through, and because of a bunch of lakes in here, they actually had to split their armies. And as they split their armies marching west, they communicated to each other in the clear on the radio. Okay, no big deal. I imagine nobody's listening. Okay, well, it turns out that right up here in a town that's still there called Königsberg, there was a bunch of Germans, and they were military, and they were tuning around on the radio, and they heard these radio transmissions that they just couldn't figure out at all. And literally, day after day, 2, 3, 4 days, they finally figured out that it really was the Russians, and it really was the armies, and they really were talking on the radio, and you can imagine the disbelief, because this is at some level stupid, okay? Stupid or necessary, depending on who you're... And the other big problem is most of the Russians who lived around here who were part of this mobilization, they were actually speaking, are you ready for this? They were speaking in German. So they were speaking in German in the clear as they were marching west. Well, the Germans, after taking about a week to convince themselves that this intelligence could really be believed, okay, because pinch yourself, it's a trick. It's a provocation. Okay, and that happens to this day. Oh, it can't really be true. They're trying to. So they finally decided this was important enough, and they basically moved an army over here and beat these guys. And then they had time to load up the army on the trains, move down. Let's see, I think I got a couple of pictures. And move down here, and then beat these guys. So about 1/4 of the German army was able to completely defeat the Russian army on the Eastern Front, taking Russia completely out of the war, ultimately. And then ultimately that led to the first revolution, the Democratic Revolution, followed by the Communist Revolution, followed by about 80 years of general unpleasantness. Okay, but it's true. So that happened. What was happening on the Eastern Front, by the way? Because these troops were pulled over to handle this, which arguably was a good investment because it took Russia out of the war, Germany was not able to finish the deal. They were not able to finish off. They got the Low Countries and they got halfway through France, but they weren't able to actually take the French out all the way. So what was supposed to have been a 3-month war turned out to be a whole different thing. And the reason is, quite honestly, or arguably, is the Russians' ability to mobilize was important. The Germans' ability to counter them owing to a SIGINT success, a totally unplanned, unexpected SIGINT success, okay, altered the balance of the war in the East. Taking those people, in fact, altered the balance in the West, and the war dragged on and on and on. And I don't know if you know any of the numbers, but in fact, every one of these countries went terribly in debt, and 1/4 of all the males between age 15 and 50 died from UK, from France, from Germany, and from the western part of Russia, died in that war. It was a civilization destroying exercise. Okay, well, fast forward from August of 1914 to September of 1914, where what I just described to you went on, to January of 1917, the Germans and everybody else were just desperate to get this war over, and just nobody would agree. The Germans had a very straightforward plan. We'll stop, but we get to keep everything we've already got. Okay, the French and the English said, we're exhausted. By the way, the Russians were gone by now. Okay, the French and the English were exhausted, but they were just not willing to give in to that. So what do? Somebody needs to break the deadlock. So the Germans decided to break the deadlock by declaring unrestricted submarine warfare on neutrals. Okay, the neutral they were talking about was us. Okay, the United States had been supplying mostly the green countries, for the previous 2.5 years. And the Germans knew that so long as that was still going on, they would not be able to win. So they needed to take America out of the war, even though America wasn't officially in the war. And the way they were going to do that is open up their submarines, who have been very effective, and allow them to sink anything in sight, which would mostly be American shipping. What the heck is this thing? Well, as they sat down and planned through what to do and how to take America out of the war, they weren't quite sure it was all going to work. They needed a little bit of insurance. And this telegram, which happens to be not enciphered but encoded, does anybody know the difference? Okay, enciphered means there's really something secret about how the true text is translated into ciphertext. This was simply encoded, which was, there was a code book that said a long phrase like "Your Excellency" gets turned into 130. So it's a data compression scheme. So this was the German data compression scheme used for their diplomatic code. This particular message was actually sent from Germany through Galveston, Texas, remarkable, okay, down to Mexico City. And what this telegram does is instructs the ambassador to Mexico, German's ambassador to Mexico, to approach the Mexicans, who'd never been particularly thrilled about America anyway, particularly since the Mexican War, and instructed Germany's ambassador to Mexico to go suggest to the Mexicans the following deal. Germany is going to start unrestricted submarine warfare. They expect the Americans might object. Okay? Gee, if Mexico would like to join the war against America and the war comes out successfully, then America will be forced in the process to give back these 3 states. I'll notice that they thought California was already weird enough they didn't think they ought to give that back. Okay? Texas, my homeland, of course these people would be horrified. No, actually, jokes aside, it turns out that is what was offered. The Mexicans to this day claim they were never interested. The contemporary literature of the time indicates that may not be true. What happened, however, is something different. Going back to that for a minute, this message got into the hands of the Brits. Okay? In a minute, I'll tell you how. But they were able to get this message and work on it for about a month and a half, given a whole bunch of experience they already had in the business with a bunch of people who were mathematicians and puzzle solvers, and it's actually an amazing story of how they put together a group to do this and how they were effective. So what they were able to do is break or decrypt or decode, whatever verb you want to use, this message. And then they had a piece of intelligence that they couldn't believe they had. And so once again, you face the intelligence problem. I've got it. What do I do with it? How do I use it in a way that achieves my purpose? What I really want to do, and it's what they did, is give it to the United States, get the United States all pissed off, okay, enough to actually join the war on the English and French side. But then you have a question of how do I conceal my source? How do I make it valid to them and not seem to be a provocation, while simultaneously allowing myself the opportunity to keep on doing it? Okay, and that's an interesting story too. And if you ever want to read the whole story on that, there's a book called The Zimmermann Telegram. The guy who sent this was the foreign minister of Germany. His name, as you guessed, his last name was Zimmermann. And there's a book by a woman named Barbara Tuchman who just lays all this out. It's a fascinating book if you're so interested in such things. Anyway, let's talk about how the English got this telegram. A little techno-babble here for a minute. There was no telephone internationally or overseas at the time. However, there was telegraph. From 1858, interrupted a little bit, and from 1866 on, there was 1 or more telegraph lines across the Atlantic Ocean. The Germans had several, and they all started from up here on their access to the, basically to the Atlantic Ocean. And they all started off, and some of them went down to France and down to Spain and down to Africa and then across. And some of them came right straight across. Remember I told you about the clock ticking up to the midnight of the 3rd of August? What was the English's, the Brits' first act of war in the First World War? Was it to put soldiers into France? Was it to, bomb somebody or something? No. Off the coast of Germany, they had a little boat. It was what we now call a cable repair ship. And at the stroke of midnight, when the ultimata all expired and they were at war, they threw over a grappling hook, grappled up those cables, brought them up on the ship, cut them, reeled them back 25 miles, cut them again, took it out to sea, and dropped the cable in the water. So they cut those cables. Okay, that was on the 4th of August, 1914. So when all of a sudden the Germans no longer had submarine cable and telegraph access to all of the Western Hemisphere, how did they communicate with all their embassies and their spies and all the other people they had over in the Western Hemisphere? Anybody got a hunch? On the radio. They got a big radio transmitter right outside of Berlin, many, many, many kilowatts, strong enough to broadcast over most of the world. So yes, the signals go to the Western Hemisphere, and yes, they continue doing business as before. But where else do they go? They also go to England. Okay, so the English were able to intercept these messages out of the air, and then with an analytic effort, were able to decrypt it. Okay, and then based on the decryption, they now had information that allowed them to bring America into the war and ultimately end the war, and more or less in the favor of the English and French. Now, the reason I say more or less in the favor is it really destroyed all the Europeans, so it's really hard to say who won. But the net effect of it is that, truth be known, it was the Americans who won in that they weren't destroyed. That's the war that pushed America, liking it or not, into the role of a superpower. And both ends of the war were determined, yes, by logistics and yes, by money and yes, by lots of lives. Okay, but the two endpoints of the war were both dictated by a signal intelligence event, accident, opportunity, whatever you want to call it. Okay, and that was not lost on people. I'm not going to talk about the Second World War, where there is a number of similar examples. You all know about the Battle of Midway. You should go read it. When I was young, the Battle of Midway was described as one day the American admiral just decided to take his aircraft carriers out into the Pacific. We don't know how he thought to do this. I guess he was just lucky. Okay, because literally it wasn't until the early 1970s that it was declassified that there had been another signals intelligence success, which was the successful decryption of the Japanese naval codes. Also of one of the Japanese diplomatic codes. Okay, but there are examples in the Second World War as well. But I want to feed forward a little bit to the 1950s and 60s. Again, playing a little bit on the age, you may see in movies and really not believe it, but I will tell you that when I was younger, okay, as a school child in the 1950s, we really did have something called duck and cover drills. Have you ever read about those or ever talked about them or seen people laugh about it? Well, it was pretty ridiculous even then, what the drill was, but the idea was, oh, we think there's a nuclear weapon coming. Everybody get down underneath their school desk on their hands and knees and put their hands over their head. There was another phrase that went along with it that had something to do with kissing something goodbye, but you can probably imagine what that phrase was. But in fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a significant escalation in the construction of nuclear weapons and then the ability to deliver them, not with bombers, but with ICBMs. Now, the reason I'm showing you those pictures, they also happen to be unclassified pictures. They also happen to be Russian ICBMs. Finally, by the late 1960s, people started to say, you know, this is insane. If we don't watch out, we might seriously blow up each other. Okay, so what do you do? Well, what you do is you fiddle around a couple of years trying to find enough political comfort within your own country to consider doing the right thing, which is to go sit down with your adversary and say, is there some way where we can both perhaps reduce our arms level and do it in a way that we both feel like we're protected, but also do it in a way that we don't feel like we're being stupid. Okay? Now, the way to feel protected, kind of, is to have a lot of these things. The way to feel more relaxed, maybe, is for them to have less of them, but how do you make the deal? Okay, here's how America made the deal, and it's not terribly unusual, and I would be reasonably assured that you could predict into the future a similar kind of pattern, and it is that you say one thing in public and you do something slightly different in private. Okay? And the deal was, basically, in so many words, that the United States Senate assured the executive branch of the United States that they would ratify a treaty for reducing arms, something called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was the first big one of these. It followed immediately by something called the ABM Treaty. And these treaties were intended to agree to do less or pull back or even dismantle and destroy certain weapons. But the quid pro quo, as far as Congress was concerned, and the Senate in particular that had to ratify these treaties, to in the background actually have some method by which we could verify that the Russians were actually doing what they would say they were doing. Nobody believed the Russians. Maybe they don't now either, but back then they definitely didn't believe the Russians. And there was plenty of reason not to. And probably conversely, they didn't believe us because we would say one thing and do something else. No country speaks with a single voice or has a single outlook in life, it turns out. So we go out, we do a treaty, half the country debates whether it's feasible or reasonable at all, but back behind, a significant amount of money is being spent on the intelligence community to develop something that has the jargony name of National Technical Means of Verification. What does National Technical Means of Verification mean, and what are you trying to verify? Well, you're trying to verify that the Russians are doing what they say they're going to do. Okay? I want to pick a specific example about that and talk about it for a few minutes. I'm not going to tell you all the details and weave it together. I'm going to leave some of it for your fertile imagination to think about. But I want to tell you a few things and then have you figure out as an engineer how you would approach this, and you might be right, you might not. Those missiles. Think about it from an engineering perspective. I build a missile, looks good, let's go put it in a hole or put it on a launcher and be ready, and it'll last for 20 years and provide me a deterrent. Is that how you would do it as an engineer? Heck no. You design these things. You build prototypes. And you do another design cycle. And then you finally have what you think is really going to be the missile you want to use. And then you test it aggressively. Okay? Round number, 30 times. Okay? No military wants to take something into military action that they don't have extremely high confidence is going to work. And that particularly includes your nuclear deterrent. So if the Russians go build a missile called the SS-18 or the SS-20 or one of those things, what you're going to be sure is they're going to take it to one of their test ranges and blast it off at least 30 times. Not the same one 30 times, that doesn't work, but 30 different ones. And you're going to test minimum range, minimum weight, maximum weight, minimum number of reentry vehicles, maximum number of reentry vehicles. You know how it is. You sort of look at the volume that your weapon is expected to work in terms of its capabilities. And you try it. You try it in every way. So, where do the Russians do their testing? Well, I got the hunch for you here. Okay. America, by the way, do you know where America did its testing? Anybody got any idea? And why they could get away with that? Well, the answer is they did it from Vandenberg Air Force Base out into the Pacific, and they did it from Cape Canaveral out in the Atlantic. One was called the Atlantic Test Range, one the Pacific Test Range. And we would shoot our missiles out over water so they wouldn't hurt anybody if they fell on them. Why were we comfortable doing it out across the water? The answer is the United States Navy. We owned the oceans. When the Russians wanted to do their testing, where do they do it? The answer is from Kazakhstan to Kamchatka. Okay, so you launch missiles from Kazakhstan, and they fly all the way to Kamchatka. How do you know how well the missile is working? Well, let's see. When it lands, you go over and take the tape recorder out of it and get all the data. Okay, well, you probably know that when they land at mini Mach, and there's not many pieces left. So in fact, doing that doesn't work. What you actually do is build into the missile what's called telemetry, radio transmitters. Are you seeing a common theme here of people putting information onto radio waves that are interceptable by others? So if I would like to know what the Russian missile program is doing, because I have an obligation to my country to verify how well the treaty is working, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go try to watch their missiles, and I'm going to try to listen to the telemetry, and I'm going to try to figure out what's going on in there and how well the missile is really moving, how much weight it can really carry, how many reentry vehicles it's really got, and all that kind of stuff. Does that seem like a plausible engineering approach? Come on, say yes. Otherwise, I'll tell you a lot more. The answer is sure. Okay, so how might I do that? Well, the trouble is this is about 5,000 miles. It's a long way. So the answer is you don't do it all in one spot. One thing I'd like to do is watch everything that gets launched here, because if you know about accelerometers and other kind of stuff, you really like to see what their setting is before they're launched so that you can predict what's happening in flight. And so I would like to be able to watch right there. How do I do that? Well, that has the problem that Russia won't let us in. The Caspian Sea is theirs. So where might I go to watch these things? Remember that picture? Do you have an idea where this might be now? Not in the Sierra, not in Alaska, it's not in the Alps, it's not in Torino. Okay? It's right here in Iran. Now, I got to tell you, there aren't any Americans there anymore, and haven't been since about 1979. Okay, because it seems there was a revolution, and it seems we weren't welcome anymore. Okay, but before that, it turns out that with that facility sitting on a mountaintop that literally is up at 7,000 feet and goes down like that into the Soviet Union. Okay, you could actually see several hundred miles from there, and when the rockets came out of the launch pads in Kazakhstan, you could actually see the rockets go and watch them. There's a combination of telescopes and radars and radio receivers, all intended to catch the satellite in flight as it goes. Well, heck, that only covers you about 1,000 miles. What about the other end? Let's take a 707, and let's fill it full of radars and cameras and radio receivers. Let's call it Cobra Ball, and let's fly it, up and down off the coast of Kamchatka. Okay, so I'm going to watch them when they launch. I'm going to watch them when they recover. I'm going to leave to you the exercise of figuring out how I would watch them in between. But I won't say any more about that. But be clever. As an engineer with a couple $1 billion in your pocket, what would you do, okay, to watch them in between? Okay? Well, the net effect is that program was very successful, and programs like that were very successful. They were also pretty expensive. I will also point out that an incredible amount of talent for doing those particular programs came out of Stanford University in companies that worked in the Bay Area. Okay, and exactly who they were and all that sort of stuff, I will not go and tell you simply because of the time limit, not because it was particularly secret. But Stanford and its emphasis in the electrical engineering department on radio stuff and signal processing and adaptive signal processing and that sort of stuff brought the keys to solving all these radio intercept problems. Now, there will be a tendency to say, well, that was then and now is now, when we've done SALT I and SALT II and the ABM Treaty and various other start and stop treaties and stuff like that. Probably this isn't a big issue anymore, but let me mention a few names to you. There's one, that's the North Korean missile. Let's see, the Iranians, theirs is named Persian for Shooting Star. Okay, the Iraqis had one, the Indians have one, the Pakistanis have one. And you just go down the list. The world is not out of the missile business. And I'm not going to tell you who the American intelligence community is looking at or not looking at, but I can tell you that it was worth our while for defense of America and its friends back during the ICBM years. Okay, if I had to guess, I would guess that it's probably important to us to be keeping track of these other people and what they can do as well. Yeah, I got a few more minutes. A little bit, let me skip that one, not that it's not important. You may wonder what we spend our time and attention worried about. If you go to the standard and even the classified versions of what it is the American intelligence community needs to prioritize, because contrary to what many people think, there is not time and energy to do everything. And no matter what the New York Times thinks, there's not enough time and energy to listen to every domestic phone call in the world. Okay, or actually any of them. But here it is. Support of military operations. Number one, if we have troops in the field anywhere, they get first dibs on assets for intelligence collection. Item number two, terrorism, wherever it is. Weapons of mass destruction, indications and warnings. Another way of putting this is Pearl Harbor. The whole reason that the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency was formed is to make sure there was never, ever another Pearl Harbor. Now you can say, how about 9/11? Yeah, well, maybe they didn't quite do it as well as they should have. But still, that was their charter, and it's still clearly in the list. Diplomatic activity, the next Zimmerman telegram. What exactly are the Russians coming to the table to negotiate? That sort of thing would be very good to know. And then another interesting thing, narcotics trafficking. And you say, oh, well, I knew it. The feds were out there trying to figure that out. And the answer is no. Actually, narcotics per se isn't the big deal. It's the incredible amount of money that goes along with narcotics and the ability for that money to completely distort the politics in many countries that we would like to have a constructive relationship with, but the money just gets in the way. So it's very useful to know why and where things are going and where the money is. Okay. I've spoken mostly about signals because I'm a signals kind of person. I want to give you another example or two just to give you an idea that it's not just signals. This is a picture of the Hubble Space Telescope. Anybody know where that was made? Any idea? Sunnyvale, California. Okay. Go down 101, hang a left on Matilda, and you're going to see a bunch of big buildings off to the left at a company called Lockheed Missiles and Space. And that's where that was made. It's a big reflector-type telescope. The signal comes in. It's a reflector that's about 2 meters big and back, brings it up to another reflector and then into cameras and so forth. Sound good? No doubt looking at something important and celestial. I would like to do a thought experiment with you. And again, if you have your pens ready, you don't actually have to do the calculation right now, but shortly you will. What I'd like you to do is just imagine taking that telescope, and I got the remote control here. I want you to take it and look down. And I'd like you to figure out on the ground with that Hubble Space Telescope how close two objects could be on the ground and me be able to resolve them. Anybody know what that's called? That's called the Rayleigh resolution. Lord Rayleigh, no doubt. Okay, and I'd like to know how accurately I can resolve two things on the ground. Now, y'all might know the formula or you might not. Say I'm about 400 miles up. That's about 2 meters. Anybody know what the wavelength of light is in angstroms? 6,000 or 7,000 angstroms. You can go. But if you go and figure out the equation, which is basically the diameter of the mirror divided by the wavelength of the light, okay, then with a 400-mile moment arm, if you will, you can figure out the answer. And the answer is 3 inches. Okay, so if I had that telescope and I look down with it instead of out, yeah, I can see my 2 fingers that far apart. That's assuming the sun is out. Okay, but still. So here's the picture, also open literature. This is a commercial version of that satellite. And also, as I mentioned, as it comes out of the Mercury News, has anybody ever watched the television show West Wing? It's the last year. You might not be watching it anymore. You might not care. Can anybody see where the West Wing of the White House is in this picture? Okay, here's the White House. That's the East Wing. Okay, this is the West Wing. That's the Executive Office building. Can anybody see where the Oval Office is? That's that oval right there. That's the Oval Office. Can anybody see which end the president sits at? He sits right there. Okay, with this picture, I can figure out within 3 feet where the president of the United States sits. This is at once real cool, and it's also real scary. Okay. But technology, as applied to imagery, the whole reason technologies like this were developed was to answer questions where the Russians really lying to us or not about how many weapons they have and all that sort of thing. And that technology has now been pressed into other services. I'm pretty close to the end, but I want to talk about one thing because it is of topical interest. The particular thing I and my company does for a living, and I'm not particularly trying to sell my company, but we're an example of it, is we do signals intelligence. And one of the interesting things about signals intelligence nowadays is that the problem is getting harder and harder. Now, for engineers and scientists, that makes it a more and more fascinating problem. But let me tell you what some of the issues are. The technology itself is growing like crazy. You may not think it is because of the dot-com boom, bust. But in fact, the technologies developed during the late 1990s are now starting to get serious opportunities to actually go be used. The other problem is the signals intelligence problem becomes harder in there because there are so many more signals. The signal formats and modulation types are worse. The signals are getting weaker. Your cell phone now transmits about 1/10 the power it did 10 years ago. Of course, then it was in a big satchel you had to carry around, and now it's small enough to lose in your pocket. The other problem is avoiding U.S. persons has gotten really hard. Anybody know what a U.S. person is? Let me explain to you legally what a U.S. person is. If you're a citizen of the United States, okay, or if you're a company registered in the United States, or you are a person that has any form of U.S. government recognized paperwork like a visa, green card, any of those things. I joke as far as a library card. Okay, you are a U.S. person and you enjoy protection under the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. Well, once upon a time, if I wanted to collect signals overseas, I was really assured that if I was in, say, Romania and I collected Romanian phone calls, that the odds of infringing on an American citizen's rights were very hard to do because, A, there weren't many Americans, and B, is the world telecommunications networks were in no way seriously interconnected. Okay, now it turns out that is so not true. Okay, you have lots of bad guys in America. You have other people in the rest of the world where there's lots of Americans. I have embassy staff and stuff like that in other countries who I want to give them their protection under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. I have American cell phone calls that go through other parts of the world. Did you know that about 60% of the Internet comes into the U.S. and then back out? Okay, if you look at a map of where all the bandwidth is, it turns out that it's extremely hard and an extraordinary amount of effort goes into avoiding intercepting traffic of U.S. persons, wherever they are, in America or otherwise. So the good news is that the signals that we want to figure out what Al-Qaeda or somebody else is doing are out there somewhere in the world telecommunication framework, but it turns out that actually getting them and avoiding U.S. people in the process is a ever more complex process. And remember, I had that view graph in 2002, not in 2005, 2006, when it's been in the news lately. This has been a growing problem, continues to be a growing problem. So, you know, you can never end up one of these things without some sort of pitch, and it's not so much necessarily to my company. Okay, but it turns out this is an absolutely fascinating technical area where people from Stanford and the Bay Area have made the major contributions in it over the last 30 or 40 years. I talk about it from the company point of view because I work for a company, but the government hires people who worry about this. Academia has people who worry about this. It's really a significant enterprise. Typically, younger folks get in it on the engineering or scientific side and later migrate into management responsibilities, some of them ending up running billions of dollars worth of money on very complex processes. And if you're real lucky, you get it done for the money you have and don't have to go ask for Congress for more. But that's another story. Another aspect of this, and I know not everybody in here is an American citizen, and so this is a freckle of a bummer, but the truth of the matter is this is an American enterprise. Our allies are also involved, and there's cross-clearances and stuff like that. But this is something that countries like the United States and our allies do in order to provide the ability to tell their citizens in good faith that they're doing everything they possibly can to protect them. And that's what we're here for. So I know some of you need to go. I'm willing to answer questions from others if you want to.
Let's give Michael a real good hand. Here's the story.